In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. This is the beautiful mystery of the Incarnation. God putting on flesh. God setting up camp here with his people. God sending those people on mission, serving the world. God inviting us to see, to touch, to know what it is to be his body. A body that was flesh and blood, a body that was broken for us. This is the story of God made flesh and what that means for those who want to follow him. This is the story of Jesus, incarnate, putting flesh on the ways and words of Jesus by getting skin in the game.
I was 14 the first time I had a chance to go to an NBA game. I'd begun to play and watch a whole lot of basketball, and the Orlando Magic were in town. And their young big man, Shaquille O'Neal, was the talk of the league. So that gives you an idea, time frame when we're talking about in the early to mid-90s, 1994 to be precise. The hometown Pacers were about a year away from a playoff rivalry with the New York Knicks that would define much of my love for the team over the next several years. And it was those series in the playoffs, the heated battles that were branded as Knicks versus Hicks, that centered around a 6'7" lanky shooting guard who played with the kind of frenetic pace and a swagger that meant you were either going to love him or you were going to hate him. And he didn't really seem to mind which one you chose. And in fact, after his career, when he penned a memoir entitled "I Love Being the Enemy," it almost seemed as if he would prefer the hate. This night, my soon-to-be favorite player of all time, Reggie Miller, had led the team to a victory over the visiting Magic. And as my dad and I began to make our way down the infamously steep stairs of the old Market Square Arena in downtown Indianapolis, Reggie, as he often was in those days, had been pulled aside to do a post-game interview with the local radio and TV media. And so he remained on the court as everyone was filing out of the arena. And as we made our way down the stairs and to the concourse level that was level with the top of the tunnel where the players would enter and exit the floor, I thought, with great hope and maybe a little naivete, this might be the opportunity I would have to get an autograph. And it turns out that night I would not get an opportunity to speak to Reggie, but I will never forget the way that uncontrollably, in a way I didn't understand, my hands began to shake as I tried to fumble out a 1994 Topps Stadium Club card of Reggie Miller out of its plastic case, hoping that I might ask for his signature. I mean, I had seen him play in the game. I had watched him countless times on television. But this was different. He was right there. At 14, it was my first real encounter with someone famous, someone of a celebrity status. I just remember the overwhelming nerves and anxiety that gripped me. Again, I'd seen him countless times, but he always seemed out there in some other reality, some other world that existed on television. But this night, he was right there, in the flesh, close enough to reach out and touch. It's weird to me, the things that kind of stick, right? The moments that for one reason or another, you never forget the details of. In the flesh. It's a weird way to say something if you think about it. But when we hear those words, we know exactly, precisely what we mean. It means the experience had some validity to it. There was a realness, there was a trustworthiness to it. When we talk about something in the flesh, someone being somewhere in the flesh, being somewhere for something in the flesh, what we're not talking about is some secondhand experience, something that is virtual, something that was digital, something that was synthesized or synthetic. We know instantly when we hear someone say, someone was there in the flesh, this was real in a different sort of way. Christian faith is centered on a reality that the God who spoke the world into existence, He who was and is yet to come, entered into the world that He created in the flesh. The technical theological term for this is incarnation. It just literally means enfleshment. And we cannot read the New Testament and make any sense of it without acknowledging its claim that in Jesus, God stepped into the world. Right? You can read the New Testament and not believe that in Jesus, God stepped into the world. That's a different discussion. But you can't make sense of what the New Testament claims to say about itself and about Jesus without acknowledging its explicit claim that in Jesus, God stepped into the world. That God put on flesh. And if you've been in the church, you've been around Christian faith for any length of time, it might be one of those things you've just sort of come to assume. Right? Like we do that with things that we know, things we believe for a long time. We just kind of begin to assume them at a level that they just kind of operate in the background, and there's something to be said for that. But it also has some dangers for us. There's this sense where if you've been around the church, you've been around Christian faith, you just kind of start to assume, well, of course, Christian faith is centered on the idea that in Jesus, God became flesh. Of course, Christian faith is centered on that because in Jesus, God became flesh. And because sometimes we assume that, I wonder if it might cause us to lose a bit of just how incredible that would have sounded to the people who first encountered Jesus. I wonder if our familiarity with the idea of God becoming flesh in Jesus kind of takes away some of the awe and wonder that is built into the very idea itself. Because Christian faith is rooted in the Judaism that came before it. And that Judaism steeped in the world and the scriptures of the Old Testament had at its core a belief we would call monotheism, the belief that there is one God. And as Christianity begins to take a foothold, Christians had to make sense of what they meant to say that in Jesus, this one God had stepped into the world. That this one God had put on flesh. They had to wrestle with the notion that there is one God amidst claims that Jesus is God in the flesh in ways that would have sounded suspect at best and blasphemous at worst. It's not by accident, it's not by coincidence that when Jesus stands trial before the Jewish council, the charge they find him guilty of is blasphemy. See, because the incarnation of God isn't the sort of thing anyone was expecting. If you read the New Testament with any sort of honest eyes, you can see that the New Testament clearly wants to make the claim that in Jesus, the promises and prophecies of the Old Testament have come to fruition and they are being fulfilled. But if we read the New Testament with honest eyes, it becomes painfully clear that Jesus fulfilled those promises and prophecies in ways no one was anticipating. See, the incarnation isn't something anyone was looking for. And yet God put on flesh. And by living a human life, dying a very human death, and being raised to a new kind of life, Christian faith took form. And for 2,000 years, Christians around the world and across the ages have found this incredible reality of the incarnation to be something on which they would bet their lives. Around the world, across the ages, for 2,000 years, men and women of Christian faith, following the ways and words of Jesus, have gone to their death precisely because they refused to deny the thing that seems so readily deniable, that God took on flesh. And so I wonder if all these years later, when this notion of incarnation is the sort of thing that we've just begun to assume at times, I wonder if that means we might lose touch with what it means for that reality to shape our day-to-day life. I wonder if we don't lose touch with what it means to follow Jesus, knowing that God took on flesh. And so as we begin this season of Lent, this season of reflection, this season that leads us to the cross of Jesus Christ, we want to spend some time looking at how Jesus' incarnation should shape our practices of the ways and words of Jesus. That there should be some specific ways that our faith is different because God was made flesh. How should the incarnation shape our faith? And how might that lead us to put flesh and blood on the ways and words of Jesus by getting skin in the game? To get us started this morning, I want to invite us to turn to John chapter 1. John chapter 1, if you have a Bible with you, open up. We'll have these on the screen for you if you're following along in the YouVersion Bible app. You can find everything on the screen there. Just go to the events tab. You'll find today's message there. You can follow along as we look into John chapter 1. And as we make our way through this series, we'll try to point to the way in which there's this series of icons on the screen, and hopefully those will begin to make sense to you as we make our way toward Easter. But we begin today in John chapter 1 with verse number 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through Him all things were made. Without Him nothing was made that has been made. In Him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. Now there came a man who was sent from God. His name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. Verse 10, He was in the world, and though the world was made through Him, the world did not recognize Him. He came to that which was His own, but His own did not receive Him. Yet to all who did receive Him, to those who believed in His name, He gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent or human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. We have seen His glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. The New Testament opens with 4 different gospel accounts of the life and story of Jesus. And each of those accounts begins their story of Jesus with their own particular emphasis. For instance, Matthew is setting out to show how Jesus is the rightful son of David, heir to the throne of Israel. And so he begins Jesus' story with that lineage through Jesus' adoptive father, Joseph, and gives us the events surrounding the Christmas story through Joseph's eyes. Mark, in his usual abbreviated, let's get right to it sort of style, skips all of Jesus' birth and just says, this is the beginning of the good news of Jesus, and proceeds to tell us how Jesus was baptized and began His public ministry. Luke, in contrast to Matthew, traces Jesus' lineage through his mother Mary, who comes from a priestly family, a priestly line. And in Luke, in the words we know so well from the Christmas story, we see the arrival of God made flesh through the woman who would bear Him in her womb. And John, as he often does, chooses a completely different direction than the other gospel writers. John starts us off in the beginning. Now, if we were playing a quick round of Bible trivia and someone posed the question, what book of the Bible is about the beginning of all things? The answer would readily and rightly be the book of Genesis. But just as much, John wants us to know the answer could also be his gospel, by opening his account of Jesus' life with words that intentionally and directly echo the opening of Genesis in its Greek translation. Okay, John's writing primarily to an audience that is not primarily Jewish, centered in Judea. And so they were probably familiar more with the scriptures as they had been translated into the language of the day rather than the old Hebrew language. And so John chooses that language, that verbiage to open his gospel with words directly echoing Genesis 1:1. In the beginning. Now, without getting too super nerdy for too long, John's echoes of the creation account don't stop there. The verbs that John uses here to talk about things being made, it's the same word that Genesis translation uses to say, let there be, and there was. And John, as he continues to describe the beginning and what implication that has on the incarnation of Jesus, begins to talk about the distinction between light and darkness in the same ways that the creation account begins by separating the two. The echoes are heavy and they are intentional. And by doing that, okay, we only want to get nerdy if there's actually a payoff, right? Otherwise, it's just random facts. John does that specifically because he wants to ground our understanding of Jesus and his identity in the story that has come before it. He wants to make clear for us, this is not a new tale. Jesus is not something that springs from nowhere. This is a continuation, a culmination, and the climax to the story of Old Testament Israel and her God. Or perhaps, a better way to say it, of God and his people. John is grounding Jesus' life and story in the story of the Old Testament. And that story of God and his people is a story not without nearness. In fact, the thing that sets Israel's faith in the ancient world apart from all of their pagan neighbors is that their faith was rooted in the fact that their God came looking for them and said, I want you. They were chosen. And then God proceeded from there to enter into covenant with them, to begin a formal relationship. This is what it means for you to be my people. The Old Testament is not a story without the nearness of God. God chooses his people, he covenants with them, and he promises to dwell among them. And when he rescues them and redeems them from slavery in Egypt, when he sets out to lead them to the promised land, he dwells with his people in the form of a pillar of cloud by day and a fire by night. And when they make camp, his presence is at the center. God instructs Moses and the people to build what is called a tabernacle, a temporary temple, if you will, a dwelling place. The tabernacle is at the heart of Israel's camp in their wilderness wandering. It has an outer court for the worship of the people, an inner court called the holy place for the ministry of the priests. And at the center of the tabernacle, that is the center of the camp, rested the Holy of Holies. Newer translations call it the most holy place. And it was there that the Ark of the Covenant was kept. And above it, presence and glory of God was made manifest. The Old Testament is not a story without nearness. And yet the Holy of Holies was as restricted as you could imagine it would be. No one could go in, save for the high priest alone, and then only once per year, on the Day of Atonement, to offer the blood of the sacrifice. Separating the Holy of Holies from the holy place was an elaborate curtain that stretched the 15 feet from the floor to the ceiling, concealing the presence of God. The Old Testament is not a story without nearness. But because God is holy, and because humanity is sinful, separation was the rule of the day. John's gospel echoes for us not only the creation story of Genesis, it also echoes for us this wilderness wandering in the book of Exodus, and echoes for us God tabernacling with his people. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And John chooses a word, I believe, very intentionally, that we could easily render tabernacled. If we can turn the word tabernacle into a verb, that is what God did in the person of Jesus. The Word became flesh and tented, tabernacled, dwelt among us. Throughout the Old Testament, when God dwells with his people, that dwelling is marked by his presence, defined throughout the Old Testament as his glory. It was the glory of God that dwelt in the Holy of Holies, above the Ark of the Covenant. It was God's glory that some of you might remember in older times that would be referred to as the Shekinah. The Shekinah glory. Getting nerdy sometimes does cool stuff for us. Sometimes it disappoints us because we go, oh, well, that's way simpler than I would have thought. The Shekinah glory, it's just the Hebrew word for dwell. The Shekinah glory is the dwelling glory of God with his people. Now, on the one hand, that goes, oh, it just means dwell. But on the other hand, guys, it means dwell. We'll try and wrap our head around that. And John wants to make it clear from the outset that Jesus is the embodiment of Israel's God, evidenced by his glory. The Word became flesh and dwelt, tabernacled among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the one and only. Remember that stripe of Israelite monotheism, one godness that we have to reconcile with Jesus? There it is. We beheld the glory of the one and only God when the Word became flesh. And when we begin to put John's opening of his gospel about Jesus against the background of the tapestry of the Old Testament, I believe we get this conclusion. It's there in the notes if you want to jot it down and fill in some blanks. In Jesus, God, who is distinct from us, chose to dwell among us in order to reveal himself to us. Okay, let's walk through that again. God in Jesus, God who is distinct from us, chose to dwell among us in order to reveal himself to us. And John's whole gospel revolves around this revealed mystery that God has come near. That he who spoke the world into existence stepped into the world that was his own. And that which was his own did not receive him. God who is wholly other than us, has chosen to dwell among us so that we might see his glory. And John says it's no longer hidden away in the Holy of Holies. It's no longer obscured and untouchable. God walking among us, speaking to us, to be seen, to be heard, to be touched. The Word became flesh. So what might it mean to follow such a God? What might it mean for us to shape our lives by the ways and words of Jesus if he truly is God made flesh? I think we tend to fall into a couple of errors. One we've already kind of touched on. One is the fact that we just sort of assume this so that we start to see following Jesus as something that happens in the abstract. Right? These are the things I believe about God. I believe that they are true. And this is my life in the real world, and I'm just not sure how much these things have to do with this. And so one mistake, one error that we can make when we are trying to get our head around the incarnation is that we begin to separate Jesus from real life. We start to say, well, I'll trust Jesus to save my soul. I'm just not sure I trust him to shape the rhythms of my life. And we go, well, wait a minute, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And it doesn't, you're right. It doesn't keep us from doing it, though. There's lots of things we do that don't make sense. And so we say, well, I might pursue spirituality. But I'm not sure how much benefit that is to my neighbors or how it impacts our shared life in the neighborhood. It's my religion, it's my faith, it's a private, personal thing. And we can become so familiar with the idea that in Jesus, God became flesh, that we start to see Jesus as out there somewhere, existing in some other world of spirituality and faith. It's the guy we see on TV. So that's one mistake we can make. The other is we can begin to assume that because God is holy, he's distinct from us, and God calls us as his people to be holy, right? And so we can begin to assume that because God is holy and calls us to be holy, that we must distance ourselves from the world and its brokenness. We believe that God has called us to be distinct, and so we assume that must mean he has called us to be distant. But how do we square that with what we've just said John is trying to help us see? How do we square that with this idea that in Jesus, God, who is distinct from us, chose to dwell among us so that he could reveal himself to us? And if that is what's happening in Jesus, God drawing near, dwelling among us, putting on flesh, what might it look like to imitate him? Might it look like this? It's again there in the notes if you want to jot it down. Following the ways and words of Jesus invites us to dwell among a broken world while remaining distinct from its brokenness in order to shine light in the darkness. Following the ways and words of Jesus will invite us to dwell among a broken world while remaining distinct from its brokenness in order to shine light in the darkness. In the same way that God drawing near in the person of Jesus does not bind him up with the brokenness all around him, he invites us and calls us as his people to imitate and reflect his life, to dwell among while remaining distinct. Too often we assume that if God is calling us to be distinct, must mean we have to be distant. But it didn't mean that for Jesus. Because in Jesus, God drew near. I absolutely love the way that Eugene Peterson renders John 1:14 in his paraphrase of the New Testament called The Message. He says, "The Word put on flesh and moved into the neighborhood." He chose to dwell among. That same word that describes the glory of God, remarkably, is the word used to talk about neighborliness, dwelling among. And following the ways and words of Jesus invites us to dwell among a broken world while remaining distinct from the brokenness in order to shine light in the darkness. Distinction without distance. Invite the band to come back. Sometimes the most profound things in the world are really simple at their core. And I think this is one of those times. It's one of those things, you're going to hear me say this and go, well, yeah. Okay, so yeah. Jesus' people need to imitate Jesus. And we go, thanks. Glad I came today for you to tell me that. Right? But let's put our head around that for a minute. Jesus' people, that's us. It's not some abstract, defined group. It's us. We've got to imitate Jesus. And if God has come near, we must reflect his life. So what does it mean for Jesus to put on flesh and move into your neighborhood? What does it look like For you to begin to see your home as the holy dwelling place of God made flesh. Place amidst the camp where God is revealing himself for all who care to see. What might it mean for you to begin to see your desk, your department at work or at school as the dwelling place of the glory of God who has drawn near in flesh to reveal his glory to all who will see. Distinction without distance. The story of Jesus is the story of a holy God distinct from us, choosing to dwell among us. And then he invites us